Ever since he was a child, Theodore Roosevelt had a strong fascination with animals and the science around them. When he was 7 years old, he acquired a seal's skull from a market and began what he called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. Much to the dismay of those around him, the young Roosevelt kept frogs in hats, snakes in water pitchers, and a snapping turtle tied to the sink. And one time he even asked his family cook to boil a dead woodchuck for 24 hours so that he may study it later. Later, as the President of the United States, Roosevelt also kept peculiar specimens, though they were alive in this case. For instance, he had for a time a pet badger named Josiah, which was gifted to him by a young girl when he was traveling the country. But the kind of animal that Roosevelt loved the most were birds. He had a lifelong passion for observing and writing about them. He could quickly identify types of birds through sound, and one of his first published works was a catalog of birds in New York. For Roosevelt, birds were an integral component of the richness and harmony of nature. In an 1899 letter, he said, "Spring would not be spring without bird songs, any more than it would be spring without buds and flowers." When the bluebirds were so nearly destroyed by the severe winter a few seasons ago, the loss was like the loss of an old friend, or at least like the burning down of a familiar and dearly loved house. When I hear of the destruction of a species, I feel just as if all the works of some great writer had perished, as if we had lost all instead of only part of Polybius or Livy. Such sentiments were deeply woven into Roosevelt's identity. He would go on to establish over 50 bird reserves during the course of his life. Now, let us step back and discuss Roosevelt's views and meta-commentary on zoology, nature, and the science of biology more broadly. Alright, I think a good place to begin is with Theodore Roosevelt's thoughts on animal intelligence. The debate over just how smart animals were, especially as a means of comparison to humans, was a hotly contested issue in the early 1900s. And, as we shall see, this zoological debate was deeply intertwined with the larger scientific and literary controversy that we will get into more detail with here shortly. Anyway, so the debate about animal intelligence perhaps may aptly be captured with the acquaintance of two of its leading voices. The first figure you should know was a man named William J. Long. Long was a nature writer who believed through his observations that animals learned how to do things not through instinct, but through being taught and experience. That is, for example, that birds are taught by their parents how to build nests and catch fish. On the other side of this debate was a naturalist named John Burroughs. Burroughs, with the weight of the scientific consensus behind him, argued that animals were unable to reason and function almost entirely out of instinct. And so, Long and Burroughs attacked each other in newspapers for years, publicly and under pseudonyms. So, where does Roosevelt come in? Well, as it happened, Burroughs was a friend of Roosevelt's. They even spent 2 weeks together, traveling through Yellowstone once. And so, Roosevelt had plenty of opinions on the matter, but as he was president at the time, he felt it proper only to comment privately. He changed his mind on that later, but let's read his opinion on animal intelligence from a private letter to Burroughs. "I think there has been preposterous exaggeration among those who speak of the conscious teaching by animals of their young, but I feel that the balance of proof certainly is in favor of this being at least occasionally true. I believe it would be very valuable if we could get observations to show its frequency and the kind of animals in which it occurs. So it is with mental processes. Man and the higher anthropoid apes, for instance, have developed from ancestors which in the immemorial past possessed only such mental attributes as a mollusk or a crustacean of today possesses. For reasons which we may never know, man, perhaps sometime in the Quaternary period, or sometime before, began to advance in extraordinary fashion. Yet wide and deep though the gulf is between even the lowest man and an anthropoid ape or some carnivore as intelligent as a dog, there are in both the latter animals and in a good many other higher animals intellectual traits, and, if I may use this word loosely, moral traits, which represent embryonic or rudimentary forms of such intellectual and moral traits of our own, and perhaps prefigure them, just as the little skin-covered bony knobs or knob-like epidermal growths on the head of the animals which, ages ago, were the ancestors of the deer, the antelope, the rhinoceros of today, prefigured the extraordinary horn and antler growth of the existing forms. Of course, my comparison is not meant to be accurate. The distance traveled in our case has been immeasurably greater, and the make-believe, out-of-door observers who read human emotions and thoughts into all kinds of birds and mammals deserve the most severe chastisement. But all I mean is that I would be careful not to state my position in such extreme form as to let them shift the issue to one in which they will have very excellent observers on their side. Okay, we have a lot to break down here. To summarize Roosevelt's view in as few words as possible, he believes in a middle ground, that animal behavior is both from instinct and from learning from other animals. Roosevelt also completely opposes the anthropomorphizing of animals. Now, the more in-depth explanation is that Roosevelt believed that intelligence varied along a developmental scale, with humans representing the pinnacle of cognitive sophistication, and other animals exhibiting varying degrees of intellectual capability. So, on the extreme ends we have people, and on the other we have creatures like fish and koalas. In between, and closer to us, are the smart animals, like dogs, pigs, and elephants. And so Roosevelt is saying that animals with the more developed intellectual capabilities demonstrate basic forms of learning, along with natural instinct. So the dog can learn some things, sometimes, but the stupid, worthless, and ugly koala cannot. It just has instinct. This suggests that organisms with lower intelligence rely more on mechanical instinctual behaviors for survival. If we dared to take it a step further, we may say that there are some living organisms so down on the scale that they don't necessarily even have instinct, like bacteria, for example. Bacteria cannot make decisions in any meaningful sense, certainly not through instinct, nor through rationality. All it does is respond to external stimuli and biochemical processes. But let's not get too deep into the weeds there. Moving on, there's a lot of philosophical implications in what Roosevelt said, but I'll just briefly focus on one. Roosevelt said that smarter animals also exhibit rudimentary forms of moral traits of our own. What he is referring to by moral traits here is stuff like reciprocity, empathy, and perhaps fairness. The really interesting thing here is the implication that some animals' basic moral traits are an undeveloped manifestation of our very same morality. I'm not sure if Roosevelt intended it, but he is kind of implying that ethics is, foundationally, an evolutionary process. That would, depending on how you choose to interpret what Roosevelt is saying, suggest that moral axioms derive from instinct and probably evolutionary pressure, or that morals emerge from some faculty other than rationality if animals have some form of them. However, in a letter a few years later, Roosevelt wrote, "I believe that the higher mammals and birds have reasoning powers, which differ in degree rather than in kind from the lower reasoning powers of, for instance, the lower savages." This is confusing and kind of contradictory because it puts rationality and intelligence on separate developmental scales, whereas before, rationality was the byproduct of high cognitive ability, and, hey, wake up. That's rude, bro. Anyway, so we have covered Roosevelt's views on animal intelligence. As I alluded to earlier, the animal intelligence debate was actually a subset of a larger debate about the portrayal of nature in writing. Remember William J. Long from a few minutes ago? Well, he wrote several books about his experiences in nature, which he claimed were 100% factual. Among other things, Long maintained that he witnessed animals intentionally bandage and treat wounds. But it was not just Long. Other popular nature writers, like the novelist Jack London, also, under the pretense of plausibility, if not outright truth, described rather unlikely animal behaviors. In 1907, Roosevelt finally broke his vow of silence and publicly castigated Long and London, calling them, quite hilariously, nature fakers. Roosevelt was extremely committed toward scientific accuracy, so when Jack London depicted a bulldog beating a wolf in a fight in his book, White Fang, Roosevelt got a little triggered and spent many words ranting about it. An excerpt. His wolf and his bulldog fought in an impossible fashion. He describes this huge wolf, which kills all other wolves against which it is pitted and all other dogs, a wolf that can hamstring a horse or gut a steer, as ripping and slashing with long tearing strokes a score of times a bulldog a third its size without inflicting any serious injury upon the bulldog. Now this is simply nonsense. 2 or 3 such bites would mean the death of the bulldog. Well, this has gotten a little silly. Roosevelt is not being completely neurotic here. Long's fantastical nature stories were in some school's curriculum until Roosevelt banned them. Marketed as pure fantasy stories, what Long and London were doing would be fine, but Roosevelt would not stand for their exaggerated, misleading, and/or untruthful representation of the natural world. And in the end, with scientists constantly disputing them, the public sentiment turning against them, and the President of the United States ranting about them, the so-called nature fakers faded away into oblivion, thus concluding this strange arc of culture and history. Alright, now let us detach from this topic and move forward to Roosevelt and Darwin and other scientific matters. So, what did Roosevelt think of Charles Darwin? Darwin was in the title, so there must be a lot to say here, right? Well, okay, you got me. You got clickbait, mate. But for real, this is more of a chill epilogue. So anyway, Roosevelt said that Darwin was one of the chief factors in working a tremendous intellectual revolution, and that he will be continued to be read in 1,000 years, just like how we read historically revolutionary scientific works of the past, even if the work technically gets surpassed by later publications in its field. That said, Roosevelt expressed cautionary words about Darwin and his followers as well. Darwin and the great scientific men of his day forced science to take an enormous stride in advance in the decades succeeding the publication of The Origin of Species. But nearly 50 years now, we have tended to make the same mistake the schoolmen of the Middle Ages made about Aristotle. The rediscovery of the works of Aristotle produced an immense forward movement in knowledge. Then there came a period of fossilization, when everybody accepted Aristotle as having summed up all possible knowledge, and when in consequence he became a positive obstacle to advance. It has been somewhat so with Darwin and the Darwinians. Instead of new research, new investigation, and sane speculation based on such research and investigation, too many Darwinians have of recent years done little except build up closet theories on such subjects as protective coloration. Roosevelt was eminently critical of dogmatism in the sciences. The idea of scientists refusing to acknowledge evidence contrary to their working theories was particularly shameful to him. So let us end this video with an instance where Roosevelt went out of his way to combat an extreme in the sciences. The example in question will be Roosevelt's criticism of the overemphasis on protective coloration in animals. Protective coloration, also known as camouflage, refers to how an animal's appearance is sometimes designed to offer them concealment. In 1909, a naturalist named Abbott H. Thayer published a book where he asserted that all color in all animals was for the purpose of enabling them to hide or sneak up on prey. Roosevelt thought that such a take was incredibly reductionist and nonsensical. Sometimes color in animals is for mating purposes. Sometimes it is a consequence of diet. And, particularly for larger animals, it is kind of obvious that color does not exist in animals only for concealment or protection purposes. I guess the point of mentioning this, and really the point of the entire video, was to 1. Share Theodore Roosevelt's not largely known or discussed views on various matters, and 2. To really present Roosevelt's character and resolve. I mean, what other president or politician would insert themselves into scientific and cultural debates like that? I mean, seriously, and not in the superficial modern sense. For Roosevelt, belief was met with action. If he had a conviction, or truly believed in an idea, he would not just let it sit in his head. He would live it. And I think if we all tried to be bold like Roosevelt in that regard, the world would be a more interesting, if not better, place. Sadly, we will have to leave Mr. Roosevelt for a few weeks, but he will be back. I think we may cover some Plato content next week. In any case, thank you for watching. If you like this content, please do consider subscribing. Alright, I hope you have a good one.